In the weeks following the Bank of Ocean's failure, it became apparent that the Pence family's position was even more tenuous than Thelma had initially imagined. They had always lived in a circumstance that set them apart from the common population of Washington County, and set apart was exactly what George had always wanted. Their elevated status had made them the subject of envy. But when your status suddenly declines, you cannot reach out to friends. Friendship implies a shared history, perhaps a mutual belonging to a church, a Grange Hall, or the PTA. But George had not been interested in any of that. He had always wanted to be someone those institutions did not apply to. Now Thelma realized the full cost of that desire. That alone would have posed a significant problem, but many people relied on the Bank of Ocean's. George may not have been the direct cause of the bank's collapse, but most of his customers found it impossible to disassociate George Pence from the bank he owned and managed. People didn't perceive him as a villain exactly, but the term pariah would have come to mind. All of this added up to an exit from Ocean's that was short on preparation and planning. What they could take with them had to fit in the trunk and back seat of their Packard. Everything accumulated over several years of marriage was left in the house, hung up or folded, stacked or secured, as if they would return tomorrow. Knowing that the sale of the contents would soon become the prerogative of a faraway liquidator, Thelma resolved on a way to tell Conchita that she was loved, valued, and would be missed. On the way out of town, she had George swing by a home she had never visited. He chafed at the delay and the need to spend another 15 minutes in Ocean's. However, something quite fundamental had changed in Thelma. The woman she was becoming, the woman who could convince her husband that we'll get through this and I will make it happen, now gave him a glance that assured him he did not have a choice. Thelma approached Conchita's front porch and raised her hand to knock on the door. Standing there with her fist in the air, she realized that Conchita had walked through their front door for years without a knock. However, Thelma was so unfamiliar with Conchita's family that the privilege could not be reciprocated. Why did I let that happen? She asked herself. Before the knock could be applied, Conchita opened the door. She, like everyone else in town, had heard of the Pence family's demise in all of its details. That information informed her thoughts about Mr. Pence's behavior on Christmas Eve, and it also caused her to believe she would never see any of them again. For a moment, the two women looked at each other as if words weren't necessary to communicate 100 different things about a score of subjects. Over the years, they had acquired a non-verbal shorthand that allowed this meeting, as brief as it would necessarily be, to share what they needed to share, words or no words. Finally, Thelma ended the silent conversation. "Oh, Conchita," she said, as the name and all that it meant for her caused her eyes to well with tears. Conchita responded with a smile of resignation. "Oh, Thelma," she said, stepping forward as she placed her hands on Thelma's shoulders before allowing the gesture to melt into an embrace. "Listen, Conchita, we must be going, but I wanted to stop by before we did. You know how much you mean to me, and I needed to see that you understood that one more time before we left." "Well then, Thelma, here it is to see," Conchita replied. Then Thelma grabbed Conchita's hand and turned it over so that her palm was face up. She took the key to their home and placed it there, folding Conchita's fingers over the only thing that still connected her to that home. "All we're taking is what we need, and all we need is packed inside that car," Thelma said as she pointed toward the street. "Everything else we've ever owned is in a house that will be ours for 3 more days. I'm giving you what's in that house. You can either keep it or give it away, but after 3 days, it will be the property of strangers." Conchita responded with an expression reflecting more regret than gratitude. She tried to find the words to stop what was happening, but no such words existed. Thelma dismissed what Conchita's expression implied. "Listen, girl, we owe you all that and more. What turned that house into a home was as much about you as it was about me. Besides, what are we going to do? Sell that stuff? And who would buy it?" Thelma stepped off the porch and began walking toward the car. Conchita followed, but moved around toward the driver's side. She knocked on the window, and George hesitated before rolling down the window, remembering the difficult circumstances of their last meeting. Once it was open, he looked at Conchita, not knowing what to expect. She reached through, putting one hand on his shoulder in a way more familiar than anything they had shared before. "Mr. Pence, I'll be missing you," she said. "I'll be missing all of you," she added, looking back at little George crowded in the back seat between piles of clothing. George, never one for words, especially in moments charged with meaning, offered a tentative smile and then looked ahead. As the engine came to life and the transmission found its gear, Conchita stepped back. She stood there, waving, as Thelma reached for the rear-view mirror, adjusting it to see Conchita's reflection becoming ever smaller. If, at that moment, it occurred to Thelma that things couldn't possibly get worse, she was wrong. They could, and they did. Over the next 8 years, they slid along a line from northeastern Oklahoma to central New Mexico that approximately followed Route 66. Their initiation to migrant poverty came at a 65-acre camp near Oklahoma City called Elm Grove, a lovely name for desperation and squalor. The camp was on river bottom land, prone to flooding, and wedged between the city dump and the stockyards. There, they learned how to rely on others without the pose of being better than anyone else. Those who lived there were divided into 2 groups. Some viewed this as the end of the line, Like everyone else, they had lost everything. But more so than many, they had lost any prospect for the future. The reasons for this were numerous. For some, it was health, for others, age, and for most, simply, a lack of imagination and hope. The other part of that population lived on the hopeful myth that this was all temporary and that circumstances were already improving elsewhere, usually further west. They would share stories about steady work in Albuquerque, a large crop needing harvest in Bakersfield, and tracks being laid in Colorado. Their spirits were lifted by exchanging these rumors. Still, everyone recognized the credibility of those rumors, and the trustworthiness of those who shared them depended on a willingness to act on them. Thus, their need to believe and to be believed often compelled them to move on before their stories became stale. What motivated my grandfather was more the memory of his ambition than the real presence of any hope. If he heard that a day's pay was available for work in another town, and that town was less than a tank full of gas away, the family would go there. However, any real strategy for a better tomorrow exceeded his sense of himself. He was like Job, who had won all that life had to offer, but then lost everything. Yet, unlike Job, he had no faith in anything that transcended himself or a belief that might redeem this terrible misery. The consequence became akin to an implosion within himself. He created a buffer that separated him from a world that, for him, held diminishing value. He acknowledged his obligations and duties, but lacked confidence in their purpose. As time passed, he grew increasingly lonely in a family that expanded from 1 to 5 sons, all of whom revolved around my grandmother. His steady descent into himself and the painful oblivion it caused eventually led him to discover a single source of relief: a bottle of Jim Beam. Oddly, my grandmother was well placed in this maelstrom of familial difficulty and national disaster. Unlike my grandfather, she didn't collapse into herself. She grew into herself. The constricted and stultifying phase of her life was now behind her. Within her was a magical quality previously disguised, first by a carefree youth insulated by indulgence, then by her early marriage, which had been the captive of privilege and isolation. Now, if everyone were to survive, that survival depended on her. What emerged was both a woman in full and a woman in parts. Of those parts, the most important was faith. The internal, centered core of who she was became profoundly biblical. Both the Bible and her church had been important in her youth. Now the Bible was to become essential, even as a church became impossible. Their migratory existence was antithetical to membership in any community, church or otherwise. But she could bring her Bible with her. And with that Bible, she acquired a relationship far more than familiar. Pages became tissue, and leather lost its luster from overuse. Random thoughts would be expressed as passages from the book of Psalms. She would describe Route 66 as the road to Emmaus, explaining whether we recognize him or not, our journey is always in the company of Jesus. Another quality that transformed Thelma was a newfound charisma that gave her significant authority. As she navigated an environment filled with need and hardship and risk, her confidence starkly contrasted with everything around her. Some perceived this as serenity. Others believed it was merely obliviousness. But regardless of its source, it was profoundly attractive. Everyone appreciated its presence, and very few dared to challenge it. A further defining characteristic was her firm appreciation for the realities of humankind. She enjoyed all it meant to be fully human, and being a woman even more. No aspect of the fall and why it had happened surprised her. The shock expressed by the devout at the sins of the weak did not describe her response to human foibles. When she was much older, and I heard her speaking with friends in the kitchen, I remember her bemused tone of voice as she said, "Oh, Joyce, please, you know how men are, and frankly, thank God for it." And so the Pence family traveled west on their version of Tobacco Road. They bounced through Oklahoma and the panhandle of Texas between various squatter camps, migrant camps, and Okievilles. Sometimes George would find work that lasted several months. And then both school and school lunches would become possible for the boys. Eventually, the work would exhaust itself, and they'd be back on the road following a list of county seats on both sides of the highway, attentive to soup kitchens, courthouse distribution of surplus commodities, and the generosity of church-sponsored pantries. The economy during the 30s was an extended cycle of mild recovery followed by relapse. The light at the end of the tunnel belied the fact of an oncoming train. After years of zigzag progress, they crossed the border into New Mexico. In Clovis, they visited with Thelma's mother and her brother's family, all of whom were enduring hardship, if in slightly better circumstances. There they enjoyed a pause that included regular food and temporary shelter, but any hope for a job that might support them was not forthcoming. One day, Thelma's brother came into the home with a rumor he had heard about a WPA project in a small town called Bethlehem. "I hear they're hiring, sis. They're putting up a municipal building, and the town's so small they're looking for workers everywhere to make it happen." That's the news. The even better news is that the railroad intersects there, and there's a chance to get on with the Rio Grande. "Where did you say this project was?" she asked. "In Belen. It's a small town south of Albuquerque, about 200 miles from here." "Berlin?" my grandmother inquired. "Like in Germany? That's an odd name for a town in New Mexico." "No, Thelma," he corrected her. "It's not Berlin, it's Belen, the Spanish word for Bethlehem." And so, after years spent in the Galilee of Oklahoma. They were about to travel toward a tiny desert town of no consequence called Bethlehem.